Alors, chers participants, merci de vous joindre à nous pour ce panel de discussion sur un sujet très intéressant et très d'actualité avec tout ce qu'on entend. Internet plus sûr pour nos enfants. Alors, dans un paysage numérique en constante évolution, la protection de nos enfants sur Internet est devenue une préoccupation urgente. Il est important de protéger leur expérience en ligne et de donner aux parents et aux communautés les moyens de devenir des éducateurs du numérique. Alors, quels sont les outils qu'on peut utiliser, les ressources également et les connaissances nécessaires pour protéger nos enfants en ligne? Pour parler de ce sujet, nous avons le plaisir d'avoir ce panel de discussion. Le tout sera modéré par M. Glen, membre fondateur du conseil d'administration de Raven, et je vous présente ses invités. Jennifer NEWMAN, directrice générale de NEWMAN au Texas. Hi. Nous avons également Sean LITTON, directeur général de Tech Coalition. Ainsi, sur ce panel, nous avons également Laetitia AVIA, conseillère en politique numérique au cabinet AVIA, ancienne députée française, avocate au barreau de Paris, experte des enjeux de droit et régulation du numérique. Bonjour. Et le dernier, mais non le moindre, M. Emilio PUCCIO, secrétaire général intergroupe du Parlement européen sur les droits de l'enfant. Alors, à vous la parole. Bonne discussion.
Thank you. Is this mic working? I think it is. Excellent, thank you. Guys, so this panel is Safer Internet for Children. I'm not sure if any of you are aware of the background of some of the folks that we have here today. It's a real honor for me to moderate this panel. I'm not talking about the age of the folks here, but we do have decades of experience in this space. I'm really hoping to draw on a lot of that experience today. We have a number of questions. If we have time at the end, I also want to take questions from the audience, because I think sometimes there are burning issues that people want to address. So we will try and make time for questions at the end. I hope there will be some. So a safer internet for children couldn't be more required now than it's ever been. From my perspective as a board member of Raven, I think we need to keep in mind that child sexual abuse, apart from all the other harms that are caused by the internet, child sexual abuse is costing our countries billions of dollars. We talk a lot about online harms and online offenses. They cause real world outcomes. So I think we need to remember that when we're talking about child sexual abuse. We're talking about real kids and real harms. We're going to start today with Jen NEWMAN. Jen, I know that NCMEC does a lot more than just the cyber tips, but for the purposes of today, we are talking about the cyber tips and how that works. Would you mind explaining what the cyber tips are and how things have changed in the last 10 years or so, please?
Absolutely. At the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, as Glenn mentioned, the Cyber Tip Line is our largest program of work when it comes to child sexual exploitation. So the Cyber Tip Line is the U.S. reporting mechanism for suspected child sexual exploitation. So that can be the distribution of sexual abuse material, that can be online enticement, child sex tourism, really anything related to a child and possible sexual exploitation. So we launched the Cyber Tip Line in 1998, so we just came up on our 25 years. And just last year alone, we received 32 million reports. So we get these reports from members of the public, but the bulk, about 99% of those reports come from our electronic service providers. So that's Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all the platforms and services that we use on our phones and we use in our daily life. Obviously, all of those platforms, and I know Sean will talk a bit about this, are unfortunately being exploited by these offenders who are targeting children. So these companies make reports to us in the United States because they are bound to federal law that if they become aware of child sexual exploitation on their platform or servers, they need to make a report to the Cyber Tip Line. Now, what this also means is that we almost become a global tip line because certainly their user base is worldwide. So we have about 90% of our Cyber Tip Line reports that resolve outside of the United States. So it's very important that we stay connected to law enforcement around the world. And that's pretty much what we do. When those tips come into us, we basically review that report. we try to geolocate that information so we can get that report into the hands of law enforcement to identify the offender, but also protect that child that may be at risk. So that's really where we rely on technology. We work on with our tech partners, because as you can imagine, 32 million reports, that's 70 to 80,000 reports a day that are coming through our systems that we are responsible for getting into law enforcement hands. Along with those reports, we had 88 million images, videos, chat logs, basically any file related to that child sexual exploitation submitted to us. So one of our challenges is that volume of reports that's coming into us and the number of files associated with those reports as well. So, you know, when we talk about what we've seen over the past 10 years, you know, we certainly see the distribution, production, and possession of child sexual abuse always as our largest category of reports that come into us. But really, in the past 10 years, we've seen a dramatic shift towards online enticement as being a big indicator of what our children are facing online. So even between 2021, and 2022, there was an 82% increase in reports of online enticement. And that really speaks volumes to how we're interacting with the internet, how kids are interacting with the internet. Platforms are built to engage people, connect people, which is great when we're trying to connect with our family and our friends. But unfortunately, again, there's that opportunity for these offenders to target children, and that's really where the tech companies come in, that's where the cyber tip line comes in, and we try to protect our children.
Thank you, Jen, and I hope that's very clear for everyone. A lot of these companies are based in the United States, and so the United States legislation is critical in this space. And as Jen said, these companies, some of them do a great job, some of them do a little bit, and some of them do nothing. And by law, they don't have to do anything, and they only have to report if they're looking and if they find something. So, Jen, one aspect which has increased in recent years is sextortion. So sextortion being the solicitation of images and videos from children. This has been around for a long time, but in recent years, the nature of sextortion has changed. Jen, can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that change has come about, what it means, and the type of people who are now involved in sextortion that actually have no interest in children from a sexual perspective, and it's more financial based?
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this, because we want to talk about this everywhere we can. You know, unfortunately, what we've seen really starting early of last year is what we call the financial sextortion of minors. And some of you may have seen articles in the news about this, but it's kind of a shift from what we'd seen historically. Online enticement in years past was sexually motivated. It was offenders who were targeting children, really drawing that child out, making that child believe they were in a sexual relationship, a romantic relationship, to seek more images, more videos, possibly meet up in person. But that was a long game. This was really trying to become invested in this child and wear this child's defenses down. What we started seeing early last year is very different, as Glen said. It is not sexually motivated. We are seeing organized crime rings out of Africa, out of Southeast Asia. In Africa, it's predominantly Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria that we're seeing these perpetrators, and they are actually targeting male children. Historically, females have been the target group for these offenders, again, for these romantic overtures, but right now it's males that they're targeting, and it is very fast moving. And so, unfortunately, what we've also seen affiliated with this is death by suicide. We are seeing these young boys pretty much between the age of 14 to 17 who think that they've met someone online who's an age-appropriate love interest. They send a picture, an exploitative picture of themselves or an explicit image of themselves, and immediately that picture is weaponized, and now this offender is saying, give me $300, give me $1,000, go to the local grocery store and get me a gift card. And what's happening is it's escalating and happening so fast that, again, these children feel like they're in a jam and they don't know what to do. We know of cases where from the first contact with the male child victim, that child died by suicide within 4 hours. There was another case where a child died by suicide within 6 hours. So it's very important that we all, everyone who has a role in protecting children, comes to the table on this. And so, you know, we work closely with the Tech Coalition to really bring the companies in. But it's more now than just the tech companies. We need digital payment platforms involved, the Venmos, the PayPals, the Zelles, because that's what they're saying. Give me, you know, $200 via Venmo. So we were able to bring them to the table. It also brought another stakeholder group, which is our retail industry, because one thing these offenders are also asking for are gift cards. They're saying, I want an Amazon gift card. I want an Apple gift card. So we at the National Center have reached out to the Retail Industry Leaders Association and started talking about gift cards. What can we learn about gift cards? But I think the biggest thing that we need to point out is that this is still happening. In the first 6 months of 2022, we received about 29,000 reports of online enticement. In the first 6 months of 2023, that's doubled. We've had 63,000. So this is not going away. So thank you for this platform to talk about the financial sextortion of minors and how we all, tech companies, digital payment platforms, legislators, we all need to come together to help protect these kids.
Yeah, absolutely, Jen. And of course, you know, for you guys, I'm sure you all know teenagers. You have that one simple conversation with a teenager and tell them, we've got your back. If this is happening to you, we've got your back. We'll get into the detail of how that works, maybe in the Q&A or afterwards. But there are people, there are professionals that can help these kids through these horrific problems. Law enforcement are doing what they can, but sextortion in particular is not a law enforcement problem to solve. It's one of the only facets of child sexual abuse that can be actually defeated with good education. Sean, Jen's mentioned the Tech Coalition. You guys have 36 members. With so much harm facilitated through those companies that you work with, harm that didn't even exist when the laws were written, how do you bring those companies together? How do you get them to work together? Some of them are in competition, so how do you get them to collaborate and partner with each other?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. So the Tech Coalition, as Glenn said, is a coalition of 36 of the leading companies. They generate the majority of the reports that Jen just referenced that go into NCMEC. And these companies have come together for the purposes of sharing technology, best practices, and also just information about threats that they're seeing to help all the companies do better. The reason they've come together, first of all, is child safety is more important than any particular company's competitive interest. And the people in these companies are just like you and I, and some of you may be from these companies. They actually care about child safety. Also, it's just the reality that no single company can deal with this problem on their own. These predators move across platforms, like Jen just indicated in financial sextortion, for example. They might work on a payment platform. They might meet the child on a social media platform, move them to a private messaging platform, exchange funds on another platform, exchange images on another platform. Platforms have to work together to really get their arms around this issue and develop effective responses. So it's actually, I will say, when I was first approached about 3 years ago to come to and work with this coalition, and I was like, is that really true? Are they really working together? And they actually are. Like there are about 26 different working groups going on with the coalition that are primarily focused on just sharing information among companies on particular issues and how to better address it so that they can quickly learn from each other what's working, what's not working, what have you tried, and then a new company can come in that has no experience with the issue and quickly get up to speed.
Thanks, Sean. At one child protection, I think it was a conference I was at, Sean was described as the most unpopular man in the room. I wouldn't do that because I'm not rude. The person who actually said it was Sean himself. So I thought that was quite clever. But it is a tough job that you have at the Tech Coalition. What does it look like for developing technologies? Because there are so many different types of companies that you guys represent. So how does that work in terms of development technologies that can be used to protect kids?
Yeah, so obviously a big piece of child protection online is the different technologies that are deployed, like hashing techniques, and then different classifiers to detect different types of activity. So we primarily work with our members in two different ways. First is some of them already have extraordinary technology. So for example, Microsoft developed PhotoDNA, which sort of formed the basis for hash matching of child sexual abuse imagery. So one thing we do is we help those companies leverage their technology to help the entire industry. And one of the things that's going on in industry is companies like Google, Meta, and Microsoft have the resources to develop this technology. They then make it available, actually free of charge to the rest of industry. But they don't necessarily have the mechanism in place to get it to everybody. So we're trying to help with that. The second thing we're doing is we work with outside vendors to develop new technology. So right now, for example, we have a partnership with Thorn, which some of you may have heard of, on a grooming detection technology. And so they've got this grooming detection technology that's still in the process of being developed. And then we have members that have the potential for grooming on their platform. So we partnered with Thorn. We bring them together with our members. We fund pilots. We funded 4 different pilots with 4 different members for Thorn to come in, train their technology on that platform, improve the performance of that classifier, and then also stand up grooming protection on those companies' platforms. So that's just one example. It takes a long time. I've developing technology, getting companies to share IP, for example. We did a partnership with NEWMAN as well for video hashing. We didn't explain hashing. I don't want to assume you all know, but hashing is this ability to give images a unique digital identifier. And then those identifiers are stored in a database at NEWMAN, and then companies can access that, hash images when people are trying to upload them to the platform, see if they get a match to known child sexual abuse material, and then block it, prevent it, report it. So with video, there's not a single dominant industry standard for video hashing. There is for still imagery. And so we worked with NEWMAN and Thorn and Google and Meta to develop a translator basically so that they could all read the same hash database, all take advantage. If Google detects something, that Meta can use those hashes to see if it's on their platform, prevent it from being uploaded to their platform, things like that.
Thank you, Sean. There's a lot of talk right now in and around generative AI. There's a lot of excitement about it, but of course there's a great deal of concern about AI in this space. The future's already here, actually, for law enforcement, and there are already significant problems. But from a Tech Coalition perspective, how are you guys approaching this threat, and what does it mean for you in the trust and safety space?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. We could talk about generative AI for the entire hour, and but it's a huge concern with, if you think about child sexual abuse imagery for generative AI that can generate imagery. And it could be taking an image of an actual child and modifying it so it becomes child sexual abuse imagery. It could be taking existing child sexual abuse imagery and making it worse or modifying it in some way. Or it could be creating fully, quote, synthetic child sexual abuse imagery. And there is a concern that if that happens at scale, it will overwhelm current systems which may not be able to detect the difference between actual child sexual abuse imagery and Gen AI produced. So we are working with our companies. Some of them have this technology. They have platforms that do generative AI and do generate imagery. For example, OpenAI is a member of the Tech Coalition. Google has this technology. And we're trying to take a safety by design approach. So the companies are working together to assess the potential risks that can happen on the front end. For example, what are the prompts that someone might use to try and create imagery. So try and put protections on the front end and also put protections on the back end to check what's coming out of the system. So that's not easy, and even assessing the risks isn't easy. So when I talked about these working groups, we have 3 different working groups within the Coalition on Generative AI. One is for the platforms that actually have a generative AI product in terms of doing risk assessment and mitigating those risks. Another is for all the platforms that are downstream in terms of how will we detect this imagery, what will we do when we detect the imagery, what should our internal policies be about how to handle this imagery. And then there's a 3rd working group, and it's our first working group that's just lawyers. And everybody's happy that the lawyers have got their own group. So, and the lawyers are coming together because there's a lot of novel legal issues around this issue in terms of how to handle it, what to report, and what are the legal implications. So that's what we're doing. We're also planning a briefing later this year in Washington, D.C., where industry is going to share the steps they're taking to address it.
Thanks, Sean. Again, it's one of those things where I love that you mentioned safety by design. Unfortunately, that's not built in before some of these things come to market, unfortunately. If it was a mode of transport, it would have to be safe before it hit the roads, but that's not the case online, unfortunately. Laetitia, if I can move to you with regards education and how crucial that is. I want to balance that by saying, whilst education is crucial, we shouldn't put this on children and parents, right? We're talking about societal level challenges in this space, but education is critical. Empowering kids and parents is critical. They're often told, parents, they must do a better job to monitor their kids online. Do you think that's realistic? And do you think parents and children should be kind of saddled with this when all of us are so reliant on this technology?
Yes, I think it is very critical for parents to have their say and their knowledge in the way their kids are using the technologies, and especially when we're talking about new technologies such as AI. But it's true that even if we just talk among us, we could feel a bit powerless. We don't know exactly what to do to protect ourselves, and then to protect the kids. It's very difficult. But I believe parents cannot just say, I don't want to deal with that because it's virtual, it's just something that is happening on their phone, on their screen, and I am educating my kids about real life. Because as you said at the beginning, there is no such thing as digital harm. We always use the word cyber violence, for example, but there is no such thing as a cyber violence. There is violence that is in the cyberspace. There is no cyber suffering. There is no cyber depression. There is no cyber attempt or suicidal. This is a real harm, a real violence, and as parents have to take care of their kids and to really, really, really try to find all the better ways to help them navigating through the digital space. Then, when we say that, what can they do? So, it is true there are some tools. We can talk about parental control, about all these tools that can just help when they are at home. That's not something that's going to help them when they go to their friends or when they're just outside. It doesn't work there. And I really believe that it's with the education from the parents that things can change. And it's also with parental, I would say, consistency. Because you cannot say to your kids, I want to reach you every time I want to reach you, and then expect them to not be addicted to their phone. You cannot tell them you have to protect your identity, your pictures, your privacy. And then we found out that 50% of the content that you can find on the computer of pedocriminals comes from pictures that parents themselves posted on social media. So parents have to be educated themselves in their use of the digital services. And I really believe that when it comes to that, there is something that is now helping in the shift in the society. First, general awareness about all this risk, parents trying to stop being powerless and to empower themselves. And I believe that laws and regulation have also a strong impact on that. If we take a regulation like the last one that was in force in Europe, the Digital Services Act, it is something that is mostly about transparency. That is something that will tell the platform, the big tech, to do risk assessment, to give information about the way they work, about the number of people they hire to do content moderation, about the way they do content moderation, about all their services in a very accessible way. You'll think, how does that help parents? I think it helps in the shift of mind, because it says, this service that you're using on a daily basis, it is not a black box anymore. You will have to know how it works. You get to master it. And as it is something that you get to master, then you can educate and help your kids through the use of the services.
That's a great answer, Laetitia. And you mentioned there in your answer, part of the difficulty is the complex nature of this. I remember years ago, we often used to see, name the 10 most dangerous apps. Well, what about number 11 through 50,000? There's so much here for parents, it can seem overwhelming. Do you think there could be a push towards something in the formal education system, given how much online plays a part in our world today? Do you think it could be incorporated into the formal education system?
Sure, because it takes a village to educate kids, right? And you definitely need to have national education to take its full part in it. If we take the example of what we did in France, it wasn't easy. We took 2 years of debates to find an agreement on this measure, but what we did is that now every kid, before leaving secondary school, has to have a proper training not in the use of computers, the use of technology, but to master the misuse, the abuses, the way algorithm works, the way you can have stereotypes, the way your critical thinking can be just enclosed in the algorithmic enclosement. And all of that is to make sure that this new generation will not feel the same way we feel, meaning powerless. This is in the law. This was voted last year, or maybe, yes, 18 months ago, and it is now starting to be implemented in France. The problem is that you need to train the trainers so they can then train the kids. But it's still very important that it is in the law, because I think the situation, it's already too late for us. But the next generation, when they will start their digital life with such a strong knowledge, they will be so much more demanding than we are. And what I hope is that when they will have this kind of discussion we have today, they will talk about their parents 10 or 20 years ago who are so foolish to just give all their data to big tech, and they will not even think about doing that the same way we did for the past decades.
Thank you. And Emilio, you've been very patient. I appreciate that. Emilio, you're from the European Union. Can you please explain a little bit more about how the European Union is helping to move from a voluntary system of child sexual abuse material detection to a mandatory one? Please tell us what's new in the EU bill that will help us prevent child sexual abuse.
Thank you, Glenn, and thanks everyone, actually, and thanks for having me here. It's a big honor and a privilege. So actually, I think after Laetitia is a perfect transition, she touched upon something that I also would like to say. So I'm actually very happy here to represent the European Parliament and to say that we are literally on the verge of doing something extraordinary and unprecedented in the European Union. Since we are moving from a system of voluntary detection, we heard from Jennifer that by American law, the companies were actually made aware of sexual abuse material and they need to report. So now with this EU bill, once this is going to pass into law, they will be obliged, not only when they are made aware, but they will actually be obliged to actively look for it, to detect and then report and then remove the child sexual abuse material. So again, you can see the excitement in my voice because I think it's extraordinary again. Of course, we heard from Laetitia before, we are dealing with a multifaceted problem, as you said before. And so, of course, it is clear that there is not a one-fit-all solution. But maybe just because I'm a lawyer, but if you ask me, I think legislation, of course, is not going to be the panacea resolving everything, but it's definitely the most powerful weapon we have at hand if we want to really change and bring about a real change in this ecosystem. So let me just tell you a bit more then about the legislation. So as you might know, of course, the European Union is also the world leader when it comes to legislation and protection of privacy and data protection. So I think it's important to say that this piece of legislation, the EU Bill to Prevent and Combat Child Sexual Abuse, has to be read in conjunction to other pieces of legislation that are already out there. So the very important element of this legislation is that it is in fact a single market. The European Union is a single market. The 27 European Union member states have one single market. We're talking about 450 million people, which, by the way, provides, I think the European Union accounts for the majority of the market share of Meta and some of the other American organizations. Essentially what this piece of legislation does is to provide a set of uniform rules and obligations for all online communication services providers. All providers will be obliged to perform a risk assessment on all their services as to whether those services may be misused for child sexual abuse material. Then, not only the risk assessment, but once there is a risk, a significant risk that has been identified with respect to one service of this misuse of child sexual abuse material, they will again be obliged to put in place some mitigating measures, and Sean was actually referring to some of those mitigating measures that are already taken, for sure, but again, this time around, they will be obliged once this is passed into law. And only as a last resort, when also after using those mitigating measures, there is still a persistent and significant risk of this very service to be misused for child sexual abuse material, the companies themselves will be then, can be mandated by an authority, by actually a judicial authority in the European Union member states to detect the child sexual abuse material, report it, and then remove it. So ultimately, I would say that essentially what this piece of legislation does is to prescribe a duty of care on all the online services providers, and it calls at the same time as well to embed safety by design tools. What we call the mitigating measure, the so-called mitigating measure essentially are safety by design tools. Another important novelty of this legislation is that it will include the creation of a EU Center to Prevent and Combat Child Sexual Abuse, or I should say the EU Center for Child Protection, as this is the name in the provisional text of the European Parliament has been taken, which will then essentially do a similar job with the folks in NEWMAN, and then, of course, they will work very much hand in hand once the center is set. Also, I think what is important to mention as well is that for the first time ever, with this piece of legislation, we have an entirely victim-centered piece of legislation. The European Center will also play a major role into helping as well victims. It will be also helping the European Union member states into helping the victims their child sexual abuse. And it will also grant a right for them to be informed when the materials depicting their abuse are found. And now, similar to something that Laetitia was already saying, and that's again why the excitement in my voice, is that it's important to say that there is not such a difference between the online world and the offline world. You know, in the preparation of this legislation, we faced huge criticism because some people were saying, but why are you concentrating your efforts on the online aspect? Why don't you tackle the real abuse? And to that, I would answer, as Laetitia said before, it's the same thing. I mean, the only, as a matter of fact, it's actually even worse if you think about it. And that's actually, I think we have sometimes trouble as public as well understanding what is really at stake when we are talking about child sexual abuse. Because the abuse has happened, has been consumed in one specific moment, except that this time around is recorded, and So the abuse portrayed in that very picture doesn't end in the moment the actual abuse is consumed, but it actually goes and re-victimizes the victim at every single new view of this. So again, I'm pretty sure if you heard some of the victims and survivors who are actually out there in support of this legislation, they could tell you that what they want, of course, they want justice. They want their image portraying their abuse to be taken off the internet. And this legislation is going to help doing that. So again, I'm very excited.
That's so good. I could probably let you speak for another hour and you'd still be going. But you have a great deal of work to do at the European Union, and we appreciate your work in this space. And again, for the avoidance of any doubt, guys, the criminals who are trading child sexual abuse material are also abusing children, their own children, and other children that they have access to. It's certainly not just an online challenge here. And I know I'm not supposed to talk too much as I'm the moderator, but the other critical aspect of this, you might not be able to tell, but my accent is originally from England. Now in the UK, there's a great deal of resource in this space to respond to the leads from the National Centre, to also mount other types of operations that law enforcement need to make in this space. A great deal of resource. 800 to 1,000 offenders a month being arrested. That's not the case in every other country. Some countries do not have the resources of the UK. And you know, for my opinion, we need to bring law enforcement per capita that only do child abuse investigations up to standard. And I'm very excited that the European Centre is going to help law enforcement in that space. Can you talk a little bit more about that aspect of it, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Glenn, actually, for allowing me to talk a bit more about the legislation and the novelties in there. As Jennifer was saying, I think the figure you said, it was 99% of the reports you guys received actually originate from private messages and from companies. Is that right? Did I get it? From companies, exactly. So, Glenn, you can see very well how, on the one hand, of course, this is the work of the law enforcement authorities, but of course, it's not about bashing the companies for not doing enough or in a way to punish them, but it's also about taking responsibility. And unfortunately, as we know very well, the majority of those crimes are committed against victims, and most of the times, actually, the abuse happens in the circle of trust of these people. And unfortunately, a lot of these crimes are massively underreported. So that's precisely why this legislation, that's why as a legislator, we actually have decided to use the single market, because it's without the cooperation with the online sector, with the companies, it would be impossible for law enforcement authorities to follow up to this huge amount of reports. And most of the times, actually, the only way for a law enforcement officer to get hold of these images is actually precisely only exclusively thanks to the cooperation with law enforcement authority, with the online service sector and the online communication services providers. So the European Centre, we actually help enormously the law enforcement authority, because the company will be actually compelled to report the images, the material to the center themselves, and the center will actually only report to the law enforcement authority, the competent law enforcement authority, only those reports that are actually directly actionable. So you see how important and critical is this piece of legislation in this ecosystem.
Thank you, Emilio. And lastly for you, but I may have some bonus questions for you in a minute. But lastly for you, a few years ago there were some voluntary principles that came about. They were mentioned at the government level, and they were mentioned by some technology companies. When they were announced a few years ago, a lot of us had a great deal of hope. Have they worked?
Well, I mean, clearly, if you ask me, they haven't worked. I mean, we heard actually from Jennifer the increase in numbers of reports that we actually experienced over the last years. And I think, Glenn, if you ask me, this is one more example to say that we do need the legislation. Again, it's not going to solve the problem, because to solve this problem, we need a whole society, multi-stakeholder approach. But definitely shouldn't be up to the company themselves on a voluntary basis. I mean, and I do agree that, I mean, a lot of companies actually, I believe in business for good. So again, it's not about bashing companies, but I think it's precisely the role of the legislator to set the legal framework within which these companies have to operate. Also, let's be honest here. The internet wasn't designed having children in mind. It got really out of hand. And again, it's not about, I don't think it's even their fault. But at the same time, since it has created this enormous distortion of the social interaction, it's really about time, and Laetitia actually said it, it's already too late in a way, but it's really been about time that we move really from voluntary to mandatory. And by prescribing the legal obligation, then you can see how, in case of non-compliance, they can even be sued and can be brought to justice. So, yeah, to answer your question, I don't think it has worked pretty well.
Thank you. Imagine a world in which the legislation is in the same century as the technology. Would be amazing. Yeah, I mean, the legislation is clearly written by adults, frankly, for adults and companies, and that has to change. Easiest question, and I probably, if we have time, I'd like each one of you to take a crack at this one. Privacy. We all want it. We all need it. Law enforcement want it. They're humans as well. But how do we talk around the privacy issue? We all want it. We all want it as a human right. You've mentioned the survivors of child sexual abuse, and we know them, and we've met some of them, and who are re-victimized on a daily basis. Their privacy is often forgotten. What about when that right to privacy conflicts with the right of a children's privacy and their right, more fundamental right to life, a life free of torture, a life free of sexual abuse? Laetitia, you want to go first, or do you want to pass the panel?
That's not an easy question. It's not an easy question because there is here a conflict between the right of privacy and also, as you were kind of, I think, saying, the need of law enforcement. That means needing to have some information about the kids sometimes and about the users to protect the kids. And the problem is that I strongly believe that when it comes to kids, to child safety, the law has to be first. The law is there to protect the society, the law is there to protect the kids, and even though we know that there can be some features, etc., for adults that will take their own decisions, I think we need very, very strong protections when it comes to kids. But then there is a question, what do we do when the authorities, the governments, will act in a manner that will not be in the interest of the kids? And who decides what is the interest of the kids? And that's what makes it very, very critical and sensitive. And when we think about it first, we're thinking about authoritarian countries, but it also happens in all the Western countries. I believe, Jennifer Schoen, you've seen all the debates around the Child Online Safety Bill and how NGOs protecting kids, and especially LGBT NGOs, were strongly against these new laws because some governments can use it to prevent kids to have information about gender identity, for example. So it's a very, very tricky question because I strongly believe that the state, the government, the laws are there to protect the more vulnerable and the kids, but sometimes these governments can be very, very, yes. So choose well when you vote.
I never said it was an easy one to answer. Emilio?
No, thank you, Glen, actually. And I very much gladly take this question. Also, although I want to make a point very clear and clarify, I do not subscribe to this idea that actually privacy is somehow in conflict with the rights of the child. I think actually the problem around this legislation has been, in fact, we have created actually the problem into thinking that somehow there is some sort of a dichotomy between privacy, data protection on the one side, and children and child safety on the other side. And I do not subscribe to this idea. I do think that, in fact, there are some of the risks. And actually, Laetitia, once again, she was mentioning about something. She was mentioning and talking about the LGBTI community or other minority or political dissidents for that matter. It is true that there might be, in general, there is, of course, a worry and a valid worry that government might use personal data to collect data on people and profiling people, and then in some countries actually minorities, political dissidents, again, they could actually risk and face imprisonment and other human rights violations. So those are valid concerns. At the same time, though, I don't think we should use this as an argument into saying that we cannot have both. We can indeed have privacy, data protection on the one side, and at the same time have child safety. It's just a matter of crafting the legislation in such a way where we heavily safeguard the legislation to avoid any loopholes and to avoid any kind of misuse of this legislation. Otherwise, I mean, everything, even when we talk about criminal law, again, I'm a lawyer and specialize in criminal law, actually, in my previous life. Even when you actually prescribe a crime, when you put a definition of a crime can be circumvented. I mean, it is a crime to kill a person. This hasn't stopped the person to kill another human being, right? So if we are serious in this, we need to make sure that we heavily safeguard this, and we also prepare to the fact that something might be misused, but then we need to work better in safeguarding it from this not to be misused. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilio. Jen.
Yeah, great comments by my colleagues up here. You know, not anything really new to add, but I think Emilio said it really well. There can be a way to have privacy and child protection. I think sometimes the two are conflated and almost become antagonistic against each other, so that, you know, at the National Center, we're a child advocacy and a child protection group. That's what we do. And so when we try to talk about carve-outs for child protection, it's very easy to be like, oh, well, you're anti-privacy. No, we're not even talking about privacy. We're just talking about protecting kids. That's what we're looking to do. So whether it's technical, whether it's legislative, legal, you know, I think that's what we just implore the solution to be, is something where there is a carve-out to still keep our kids safe online and respecting that right to privacy. So I think I would just add to the conversation, just make sure that we decouple those two things, because they are not opposing opposites. You know, and sometimes in those conversations, when we do try to speak about child safety, it can very much be interpreted as anti-privacy, and that's not the case.
Yeah, and Sean, I know obviously from the Tech Coalition perspective, it must be quite a conflict as well, right? Because there are a lot of pressures on either side of this debate.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great interest in providing privacy to people and honoring their privacy. There's also a great interest in ensuring that your platform is safe for children. And I think one of the dimensions, it's not a static situation, it's dynamic and it's situational. So, for example, if your product is designed for young children, right, it will have different safeguards than if your product does not allow young children on it. And these are the same dynamics we see in the physical world, right? It's, you know, in a classroom of children, there are certain safeguards in place that are not in place for a group of adults, because children need to be safeguarded. So, and to the extent you want to do that in a way that honors privacy, both the privacy of the children and everyone else. But I think it's sort of, you know, each situation requires a balancing of those rights. And I know this has been a huge challenge in Europe and in other places where this legislation comes forward. But I think, you know, the child advocacy people need to do a good job of explaining the rights of the children and putting those forward, and then the privacy right is also important, and then that conversation needs to happen and that balance needs to be struck. But I don't think it's the same balance in every situation. Does that make sense?
No, it makes complete sense, and I loved what Sean said there about apps and games that are designed for children. Of course, there are natural choke points there with the Google Store and the Apple Store, where if those child safety elements were employed, they could get a tick mark to say this is safe for kids, at least to help the parents figure that stuff out.
Yes, if I can just jump on it, I'm not really sure that an app that is just designed for kids is something that is positive. First, that you know there is a room full of kids, and that is the first target for all the pedocriminals. They know where they're going to find them. And also, I think the parents are less cautious because they think they have a device that is designed for the kids and that is safer for the kids. So that will be, I believe, a good solution if it is safe by design and if there is a risk assessment before. showing that all the features necessary for the safety of the kids and the way their data, all the information is used by the platform is safer than in a general app. If this exists, that could be a good solution. But as of today, we don't have that, I believe.
Yeah, I completely agree with Laetitia, and in my law enforcement experience, certainly wherever there are children, there are criminals as well. Guys, the good news is we've kept some time back for questions, so hopefully there will be someone brave to go with the first question for this panel. Here you go. Come and use this.
So hello, I'm Fadwa Mohana. I'm CEO of 137, a digital identity platform. It's something you mentioned about the internet was never designed for children, but the internet was never designed even for human beings. Like there is no identity layer in the. So solving for the children issue would also solve for the adults issue logging on. So just our technology, I mean, some of what we do is the digital wallet that proves who you are in a verifiable credential, privacy preserving. So your question about how can we have both. And this can have a custodianship feature where you can add your kids' wallet within the parent wallet and knowing where your kids are logging in, where platform, if a predator is trying to log in, they wouldn't be able to log in. So I'm trying today, technology has caught up now in order to have both privacy preserving and identity verification to log in somewhere. However, like even though the technology is catching up, legislation needs to be mandating it so that we can roll out faster. We should have like thought leadership asking for it to be implemented. So there are technology now able to protect our children. Just how can we advance the conversation and the adoption of such technologies is a kind of the challenge. Any advice, any thoughts on that?
So age verification, et cetera, it's a significant issue. And there is no industry standard yet on this issue. There is some potential legislation, I think, in the UK. What I can say is there is within the tech coalition, so for example, you can imagine these 35 companies trying to figure it out, how can we do this in a way that both respects individual privacy, diversity, et cetera. There's a group of companies that are coming together to compare solutions, to vet solutions, and to try and create a framework for evaluating potential solutions. So that's one way. I mean, and that conversation's already happening. I'd say the conversation still has a long way to go. And I do think it's a very important conversation with respect to this issue.
Thank you, Sean. Emilio?
Yeah, and if I may add to that, in fact, also in the European Union, there's the Article 6 of the proposal that I was just describing, in fact, precisely talks about the age verification. And as a matter of fact, when this proposal is going to pass into legislation, it's going to be mandatory for certain companies to actually do the age verification. And in a privacy-preserving manner, as you said very well, there are ways of doing this. Once again, there are ways of doing this in a privacy-preserving manner without collecting any data, because at the end of the day, you are right. The internet wasn't designed for kids, it wasn't designed for human beings. It's also important to keep the anonymity. It is important to keep anonymity on the internet. But at the same time, we should avoid that the internet then become a hiding place for perpetrators, right? Because I always answer to this question when people say, oh, but how can you do the age verification without collecting data? Or why do you do the age verification? It is important that this, again, the anonymity. But to this question, I would answer, when you go to a supermarket, to a store, and you want to buy, I think in North America it's pretty much the same, actually, see, when the higher the age, and you are a minor, you're not allowed to buy alcohol, right? And the store, the guy, is actually obliged to ask you for an ID, right? So I do not understand why we have such a hard time expecting from the internet to abide by the same rules that we have in the real world out there.
I love that answer. I loved your question. Again, we live in a world, ladies and gentlemen, where 8-year-old little Johnny cannot place a bet on a football game, but we, society, let 8-year-old Johnny watch hardcore adult pornography, and we, society, we call it good. It's crazy. Laetitia, you had something to add?
Yes, I wanted to jump in on what Emilio said. I think the problem is that who is collecting the data? When you go to your grocery store, I think there is a social contract, agreement, trust between you and your grocery store. And they've never been using your data for doing anything wrong to you. So that's why you give your ID. There is no problem giving your ID. The problem is that we had 2 decades of big tech using our data, doing all these behaviors that we know we cannot allow anymore. So that's why we don't want to give this information, this additional information to the big tech. So what can be the answer to that? It's to use a trusted entity. It has to be a trusted entity that could collect the data, that could verify the age, and that could then help to have a safer use of all these platforms. But it cannot go to the big techs, cannot go to the government either because it can be dangerous. It has to be a trusted entity, and as of today, I don't know who will be or what will be this entity.
There actually are technologies that exist, right? Emilio, you want to expand?
I just wanted to say exactly that. No, I didn't want to go into details on the technology, but I wanted to say that they do exist. There are ways of doing this without collecting any data. And as a matter of fact, the Article 6 of the legislation that I was mentioning before precisely says that. So we are okay with doing the age verification, but in a privacy-preserving way. And there are ways of doing this, precisely with the third parties. And there are companies, I think there is this company in the UK, Yachty, right? Yes. Yeah. But there are also other companies, and even the French Data Protection Authority said that there are ways of doing this without collecting any other data, without even processing any biometric data, for instance, because this is also another big issue. And I would agree with you, again, that there are very valid points that sometimes are raised. But again, the solution lays on the technologies. And that's why I said before, it's up to us, to the legislator, to tell you what are the principles to respect, but then it's up to the companies to figure it out. They do it much better than us, frankly.
Any other questions, guys? We might have time for one more. At the back, you want to make me run around? I'll do it.
Thank you. This is Carlos Puente from Spain. In this type of problems, I'm always thinking about what you said before, Emilio, about this is not a technology problem, this is a social problem. Why are not we taking more steps forward to reduce the consumption of this type of criminal content, the child sexual abuse? It's possible. We can manage to offer some mental health services to persons, to people who feel themselves this type of attraction. Why aren't we going one step forward for that? Thank you.
This is a long answer. Who wants to go first?
No, I very much agree to these questions. And as a matter of fact, I think we should look at this problem not only as a societal problem, but also on the public health perspective. Because at the end of the day, we didn't say it before because, again, I could talk for hours about this, of course, but at the end of the day, there is, I can't remember the exact figure, the exact percentage, but there is a certified percentage of the male population that has a sexual interest of children. It's horrible to say. I understand it is a sad reality to swallow, but this is the reality. So, as a matter of fact, there is another important legislation that is in the European Union, is the Directive 93/2011, and this is more of a criminal law instrument. But as a matter of fact, there are actually great examples within the European Union itself where people who actually recognize and acknowledge to have this problem, because at the end of the day, we should talk about this as a mental health issue, right? Those people can actually get support and help in some European Union member states. Germany is an example, Sweden is an example as well, for free, as the national health system. So I agree with you, it's a societal problem, and I will go even further into saying there is a public health problem. Thank you.
And I would just add, there are some organizations that are working on that. Stop It Now is, I think they're global, and they do a lot of work on kind of that interdiction for those tendencies. Lucy Faithfull Foundation over in the UK. So there are organizations out there that are, like Emilio said, trying to support these offenders or maybe soon-to-be offenders, yeah, who have these urges or these attractions, to really try to help stop that behavior or not let them, expose and actually do it. So there are some organizations out there that are working on that. Yep.
Guys, thank you. We're up against time now, but I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel for sharing your experience. Thank you.